The blade at my throat belongs to my own brother. That's the part nobody would believe. Not the duel, not the crowd, not the blood already soaking into the training grounds. The part nobody would believe is that Draven Ashvane, heir of the greatest sword family in the Empire, just tried to kill me in front of 1,000 witnesses, and our father watched with his arms crossed like it was a normal Tuesday. I'm on my knees, my sword is 3 feet away, useless, and Draven is smiling down at me like he already won. "Stay down, Kieran," he says. "It's easier for everyone." Here's the thing though, I'm not staying down, not today, not after everything that led to this moment. Because what Draven doesn't know, what none of them know, is that the thing sleeping inside my chest has been waking up for weeks, and it picked today, of all days, to finally open its eyes. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the context, and trust me, the context is insane. My family is the Ashvane bloodline. For 300 years, we've produced the strongest swordmasters in the Empire. Generals, duelists, legends carved into statues in the capital. Every single Ashvane child is born, trained, and measured against one impossible standard, and if you fall short, you don't get comfort. You get erased from the family records like you were never born. I was supposed to be the prodigy. Youngest son, sharpest instincts, the one tutors whispered about when I was 6 years old, and already outpacing boys twice my age. Then, everything changed, the year I turned 12. My sword arm stopped growing stronger. My reflexes plateaued, while my older brothers kept climbing, rank after rank, tournament after tournament. I froze in place like the world had put a ceiling over my head and forgotten to tell me. 5 years of stagnation. 5 years of my father looking at me like I was a stain on the family crest. And Draven? Draven made sure everyone in the Empire knew exactly what I'd become. The failed son, the joke. The one Ashvane who couldn't even beat a servant boy in a sparring match. What none of them knew was why. The truth is buried in a single letter my mother left before she died. A letter I wasn't supposed to read until I turned 18. I read it early. Big mistake. Or maybe the best mistake of my life, depending on how you look at it. The letter said I wasn't just an Ashvane. My mother wasn't fully human. She carried the blood of the last dragon sovereign, a bloodline the Empire had hunted to extinction 200 years ago for the crime of being too powerful to control. She hid what she was for her entire life. She married into the Ashvane family specifically because Swordmaster blood is the only kind of power dense enough to mask dragon blood from detection. And she passed that inheritance to exactly one child, me. The reason my growth stopped at 12 wasn't weakness, it was suppression. My own body was locking the dragon blood down so hard that it strangled my human training along with it, like two rivers fighting for the same channel and drowning each other in the process. I'd spent 5 years being humiliated for a war happening inside my own bones that I didn't even know was happening. And today, in front of the entire Ashvane household, that war finally ended. Here's how we got to the blade at my throat. The Empire holds an event every year called the Proving, where every Ashvane child under 20 duels in front of the family elders to be ranked for inheritance. Miss the cut, and you lose your surname, your title, your right to ever call yourself an Ashvane again. This year was my last chance before the age cutoff. Everyone assumed I'd lose in the first round and be quietly disowned before lunch. Draven volunteered to fight me personally, not because tradition demanded it, because he wanted to be the one who ended my name. "Let me do it," he told our father the night before, and I heard every word through the wall, because apparently Ashvane mansions have terrible soundproofing and terrible people living in them. I want the servants to see exactly what happens to weak blood. My father didn't stop him. My father actually smiled. That's the family I grew up in. That's the love I was working with. So we stepped onto the training grounds at dawn, torches still burning, breath fogging in the cold, and Draven didn't even bother with a proper opening stance. He just walked toward me like I was furniture in his way. "Last chance to forfeit," he said. "Save yourself the bruises." I didn't answer. I drew my sword instead, the same dull, unremarkable blade I'd used for 5 humiliating years. And something in my chest twisted, tight and hot, like a fist closing around a coal. He came in fast. Faster than a first strike should be, honestly, considering he was supposed to be testing me, not ending me. His blade caught my shoulder before I even registered the motion. A clean line of pain, blood soaking instantly into my sleeve. The crowd gasped. My father didn't move. I hit the ground hard. "Pathetic," Draven said. loud enough for the entire courtyard to hear. 5 years of nothing, and this is what we get. You should have stayed hidden in your room where you belong. That should have been the moment I gave up. It wasn't, because right then, kneeling in the dirt with blood running down my arm, I felt it. The coal in my chest cracked open, and heat poured out of it like a furnace door swinging wide for the first time in 5 years. My vision sharpened. The torches around the courtyard suddenly looked dim, like my eyes had been squinting through fog my entire life, and someone had finally wiped the lens clean. Draven raised his sword for the finishing blow, the one meant to end the match and, unofficially, end my place in this family forever. And that's when I caught the blade with my bare hand, not blocked it, caught it. Fingers wrapped around cold steel like it was a stick. A child swings in a garden, and the entire courtyard went silent. In that specific way a crowd goes silent right before somebody starts screaming. Draven's face did something I'd never seen it do before. Fear. Actual, unmistakable fear. What? He started, and never finished the sentence, because I stood up. Heat rolled off my skin in visible waves. The dirt beneath my boots cracked in a rough circle, like the ground itself was retreating from whatever had just woken up inside me. Somewhere behind me, one of the elder judges whispered a word I wasn't supposed to understand yet. Dragonkin. I didn't know what that meant, not fully, not in that moment. All I knew was that the sword in Draven's hand suddenly felt like a toy, and the boy holding it suddenly looked very, very small. He tried to pull the blade back. I didn't let go. Instead, I turned it, slow and deliberate, until the edge that was supposed to end my life was pointed instead at his throat, my grip so tight the steel groaned in protest. You said stay down, I told him, and my own voice sounded strange to me, deeper, layered, like something ancient was speaking underneath my words. I think I'm done doing that. He dropped the sword, actually dropped it, hands shaking, and stumbled backward into the dirt he'd just knocked me into 30 seconds earlier. Status flip complete. The bully who'd spent 5 years building his reputation on my back just lost control of the one thing that had always guaranteed him respect, and he lost it in front of every single person who mattered. My father finally moved. He stepped forward, face unreadable, and for one insane heartbeat I thought maybe, finally, he was going to say something that resembled pride. What? He said instead, voice cold as the training ground stones. Did your mother do? Not concern, not relief that his son wasn't dead. Suspicion, calculation, like he'd just discovered a weapon he hadn't budgeted for and needed to figure out how dangerous it actually was before deciding what to do with it. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know about where I actually stood in this family, even now, even after everything. 5 years of silence, and the first real reaction out of him wasn't relief that his son was still breathing. It was a calculation about value. I remember thinking, in that strange, calm way you think things when your whole world has just flipped upside down, that if I'd died on that training ground 10 minutes earlier, he might have felt something closer to loss. Now that I'd survived and turned out to be useful, all he felt was opportunity. Great, just great. Turns out almost dying doesn't fix a family. It just changes what they want from you. I almost said something. I almost let 5 years of resentment come pouring out right there in front of the whole courtyard, in front of Draven still shaking in the dirt, in front of every cousin who'd never once bothered to learn my favorite color, but somehow already knew every rumor about my failures. I didn't. Not yet. Some instinct, maybe human, maybe older than that, told me this wasn't the moment to burn every bridge. Not when I still didn't understand what I'd become. Not when the fire in my chest still felt like a stranger wearing my skin. The elder who'd whispered dragonkin stepped forward next. An old woman named Solvette who'd overseen every proving for 40 years and had never once, according to family legend, shown surprise at anything. She was showing it now. Impossible, she said, staring at the cracked earth beneath my boots. The dragon sovereign line was ended 2 centuries ago. Every descendant, every branch, confirmed and recorded. Apparently not every branch, I said, and something about saying it out loud, finally, after 5 years of silent humiliation, felt like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying since I was 12 years old. The heat in my chest didn't fade. If anything, it settled, like something ancient had finally found a comfortable place to sit after 200 years of hiding, and it had no intention of getting up again. Draven found his voice from the dirt, shaky but venomous. This doesn't change anything, he spat. You're still nothing, a freak, An accident. The elders will strip your inheritance the second they figure out what you actually are. He had no idea how wrong he was. Because the moment Elder Solvet turned to face the gathered crowd, her expression had shifted from suspicion into something closer to hunger. "The Ashvane family," she announced, loud enough for every servant and cousin and disowned uncle standing in that courtyard to hear, "has just produced the first confirmed dragon-blooded swordmaster in 200 years. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before it broke into absolute chaos. Cousins who'd never spoken a single word to me suddenly wanted to know my schedule. Servants who used to avoid eye contact were suddenly bowing. My father's expression cracked, just slightly, into something that looked less like suspicion now, and more like a man realizing he'd been sitting on a fortune he almost threw away. And Draven. Draven just stood there in the dirt, sword abandoned beside him, watching 5 years of built-up superiority evaporate in front of the entire family in under a minute. I should have felt satisfied. For about 10 seconds I did. Then Elder Solvet's expression shifted again, and this time it wasn't hunger. It was fear. Real fear. The kind old people only show when they remember something they'd hoped to forget. "There's a reason the dragon sovereigns were hunted to extinction," she said quietly. Quiet enough that only the people closest to me could hear it. It wasn't because the Empire feared their strength. "Then what?" I asked, and the heat in my chest went cold for the first time since it woke up. "It was because of what wakes up alongside that strength," she said. "The dragon sovereigns didn't just gain power as their blood awakened. They gained enemies, ancient ones. Bound to the bloodline itself, older than this empire, older than the family that hunted them down. If your blood has truly woken, Kieran Ashvane, then somewhere out there, something else just woke up too. Something that has been waiting 200 years for exactly this moment." That should have been enough bad news for one morning. It wasn't, because right then, high above the courtyard, the sky split open with a sound like the world itself tearing along a seam, and every torch in the training ground guttered out at once. I looked up, so did everyone else, and carved into the clouds, glowing faint and ancient and utterly wrong against the dawn light, was a symbol I'd never seen before in my life, yet somehow recognized instantly, like a memory that belonged to someone else and had just been handed to me without permission. A crown, broken in half, wreathed in fire. "That," Elder Solvet whispered, "is the sigil of the Cinder Court, the ones who hunted your mother's bloodline to extinction. And they just found out it isn't extinct anymore." The mark burned brighter for exactly 3 seconds, then vanished, leaving nothing behind but a courtyard full of terrified relatives and one very confused, very overpowered 15-year-old standing over the brother who'd tried to kill him an hour ago. Draven used the distraction to scramble backward and vanish into the crowd, already whispering to anyone who'd listen that I was a curse, a monster, a threat to the entire family. Big surprise. Some people don't learn even after watching their own worldview burn to the ground in front of them. My father approached again, slower this time, and for once his expression wasn't calculation. It was something closer to genuine concern, 5 years too late to mean much, but there nonetheless. "If the Cinder Court is still active," he said, "they will come for you. Not tomorrow, not next week, soon." "Good," I said, and I meant it, because for the first time in 5 years I wasn't the weakest person in the room, and honestly, after everything Draven and this family had put me through, a little bit of me wanted them to come, wanted a real fight, one where the outcome wasn't decided before it started, one where I got to find out exactly how far this fire in my chest could actually go. That should have been the end of the morning's drama. It wasn't. Because 3 hours later, while I was still bandaging the shoulder wound Draven gave me before everything changed, a servant burst into my room without knocking, pale as parchment, stammering something about the front gates. I walked outside to find a woman standing at the entrance to the Ashvane estate who hadn't been announced, hadn't been let in by any guard, and yet stood there like she'd simply decided the gates didn't apply to her. Dark armor, no house crest, a sword resting casually across her shoulders like it weighed nothing at all, and stitched faintly into the collar of her cloak, half hidden but unmistakable once you knew to look for it, a broken crown wreathed in fire. "Kieran Ashvane," she said, and her voice carried the same layered, ancient quality mine had taken on in the courtyard, like something old was speaking through a much younger mouth. "My name is Isolde Varric. I've been waiting 200 years for a bloodline to wake up stupid enough to announce itself in front of 1,000 witnesses." I didn't exactly plan the timing, I said, because apparently sarcasm survives even ancient dragon awakenings. She smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. The Cinder Court doesn't send its strongest hunter for the weak ones. We send her for the ones who might actually be a problem. She drew her sword, slow and deliberate, the kind of motion that says, I have already decided how this ends. Let's find out which one you are. And that's when I realized the fight with my brother wasn't the climax of my morning. It was the warm-up. Behind me, I heard the entire Ashvane household pouring out of the mansion to watch, my father included, and for the first time in my life I understood exactly what it felt like to have every single person who'd ever doubted me standing in one place at the exact moment I might die in front of them. No pressure. Isolde didn't wait for a bow, a signal, or any of the formal nonsense the Ashvane family usually drowned their duels in. She just moved, and I mean actually moved, closing 20 feet of open courtyard in less time than it took my brain to register she'd started running. Her blade came in low, aimed at my legs, the kind of strike meant to end a fight before it becomes one. I got my sword up on pure instinct, no thought involved, and the impact sent a shockwave through my arms that rattled my teeth. She smiled again. Reflexes. Good. Reflexes I expected. Let's see if there's anything behind them. She didn't slow down after that first exchange. If anything, she sped up, blade flashing in patterns I couldn't track. Each strike aimed somewhere different, testing, probing, looking for the gap that would end this in one clean motion. I blocked what I could. I dodged what I couldn't block. And every time steel met steel, that heat in my chest flared brighter, like each near-death moment was feeding it instead of scaring it back into hiding. Then she caught me. A clean cut across my ribs, shallow but burning, and I stumbled back into the dirt for the second time that day. Disappointing, she said, though something in her tone suggested she didn't fully believe her own word choice. The bloodline of a dragon sovereign, and this is what 200 years of waiting gets me. Here's the thing about being told you're disappointing twice in one morning, first by your own brother and now by a stranger who wants you dead. It stops feeling like an insult. It starts feeling like a pattern. And patterns, once you notice them, are things you can finally get angry about instead of just absorbing. The heat in my chest stopped flickering and became something steadier, something with weight behind it, like a furnace finding its rhythm after being lit for the very first time. I stood back up. Slower this time. Deliberate. You said the dragon sovereigns weren't hunted for their strength, I said. You said it was because of what wakes up alongside it. That's right, Isolde said, circling now, sword loose at her side, studying me the way a hunter studies wounded prey, deciding whether it's worth finishing off or better left to bleed out on its own. Then maybe, I said, you should be more worried about what's still asleep. I don't fully know how to describe what happened next, even now, even having lived through it. The heat didn't just flare, it answered. Something ancient inside my own blood recognized the crest on her collar, recognized the name Cinder Court like an old wound recognizing the exact weapon that first cut it open 200 years ago, and it responded with something that wasn't quite memory and wasn't quite instinct but sat somewhere dangerously between the two. My vision sharpened again, sharper than before. The dull practice sword in my hand suddenly felt wrong, too plain, too human for what was moving through my arm, and when Isolde came at me again, faster than the first exchange, faster than anything I should have been able to track, I moved to meet her without deciding to. Steel met steel, and this time it was her blade that nearly shattered. She staggered back, staring at the hairline crack running down her sword, staring at me like I'd just become a different person mid-fight, which, honestly, felt about right. That's not possible, she said, and for the first time, her ancient, layered voice cracked into something almost human. The bloodline doesn't awaken that fast, not in one day. Not without a trigger. Maybe you're the trigger, I said, and I meant it as a taunt, but the second the words left my mouth, I realized how true they might actually be. Elder Solvet had said something wakes up alongside the bloodline's strength. Maybe it wasn't just enemies. Maybe it was defense mechanisms 200 years old, finally recognizing the exact kind of threat they were built to answer. Isolde's expression shifted from confusion into something colder, more calculating. The look of a hunter realizing the prey in front of her might actually be capable of hunting back. The Cinder Court didn't send me here to have a nice conversation about triggers, she said, and lunged again, faster, harder, no longer testing but committing fully to ending the fight in one motion. I caught her blade with my bare hand again, the same trick that had ended things with Draven that morning, except this time she was ready for it. twisting the sword at the last second to slice across my palm instead of letting me grip it clean. Blood ran down my wrist. The pain should have staggered me. Instead, it did something else entirely. The blood hit the cracked earth beneath my boots, and where it landed, faint lines of fire traced outward across the dirt, like veins lighting up beneath skin, spreading in patterns that mirrored the broken crown sigil that had appeared in the sky that morning, except inverted, except mine. Isolde's eyes went wide, actually wide. The confident hunter energy drained out of her expression in real time, replaced by something I hadn't expected from someone who'd apparently spent 200 years or several lifetimes preparing for exactly this encounter. "That sigil," she whispered, "belongs to the sovereign line itself. Not a hunter mark, not a corrupted echo, the actual crown. Is that bad for you?" I asked. Mostly because at this point, sarcasm was the only thing keeping my legs steady. Or bad for me. "Both," she said. "Neither. I don't know anymore." She took a step back, sword lowered slightly, and for the first time since she'd walked through those unguarded gates, she looked less like a hunter closing in on prey and more like someone recalculating an entire mission in real time. My orders were to confirm the bloodline and eliminate it before it fully woke. Quiet. Contained. One casualty, no witnesses, no complications. She gestured at the courtyard, at the burning sigil fading slowly into the dirt beneath us, at the entire Ashvane household watching from the mansion steps with expressions ranging from terror to something that looked uncomfortably close to reverence. "This," she said, "is the opposite of quiet." "Not my fault you picked a bad morning," I said. Something in her expression flickered, and for one strange second I almost thought she was going to laugh. She didn't. Instead, she sheathed her cracked sword, slow and deliberate, and the sudden absence of immediate threat felt somehow more unsettling than the fight itself. "I'm not finishing this today," she said. "Not because I can't, because if what I just saw is real, killing you here accomplishes nothing except making the Cinder Court's actual problem worse. They'll want to know exactly what woke up in this courtyard before anyone decides what happens next." "So I just get to walk away," I said, not quite believing it. "After all that, you get a delay," Isolde corrected. "Enjoy it. It won't last." She turned to leave, then paused, glancing back over her shoulder with an expression I couldn't fully read, somewhere between warning and, strangely, something almost like respect. "For what it's worth, Kieran Ashvane, you're the first bloodline awakening I've witnessed in person that didn't beg." "Didn't occur to me," I said honestly. "It should have," she said. "Everyone begs eventually. Remember that the next time we meet." And then she was gone, vanishing through the same gates she'd walked through uninvited, leaving behind a cracked training sword, a scorched sigil slowly fading into ordinary dirt, and an entire household of relatives who now had absolutely no idea what to do with the son they'd spent 5 years treating like a family embarrassment. My father was the first to speak, once the silence broke. "The Cinder Court doesn't send hunters for confirmation missions," he said quietly. "They send them for eliminations. The fact that she left alive means one of two things. Either she genuinely believes you're too dangerous to kill quietly, or she's reporting back for reinforcements." "Comforting," I said. "It should be," he said, and for the first time in 5 years, something in his voice actually sounded like a father instead of a judge. "Because it means the strongest hunter the Cinder Court has looked at my son and decided he wasn't prey." Draven, still lurking at the edge of the crowd with a bandaged wound to his pride that would clearly take longer to heal than the one on my shoulder, opened his mouth like he wanted to say something cutting, something that would drag the moment back down to where he still had the upper hand. Nothing came out. For once in his life, Draven Ashvane had absolutely nothing to say. Elder Solvet approached last, studying the fading sigil in the dirt with an expression of pure academic terror, the kind reserved for historians, who just watched a legend they'd spent their entire career insisting was extinct stand back up and start talking. "The broken crown sigil hasn't manifested in 2 centuries, she said. "Not once. Not during any recorded skirmish, any awakening, any confrontation with the Cinder Court's known targets. Whatever woke up inside you today, Kieran, it isn't just dragon blood." "Then what is it?" I asked, and some part of me already suspected I wasn't going to like the answer. "It's the Sovereign Line's original defense," she said. "The thing the Cinder Court hunted the bloodline to extinction, specifically to prevent from ever manifesting again. And it just manifested in a training courtyard, in front of 1,000 witnesses, on the exact same day you nearly died twice. I looked down at my hand, still bleeding faintly, still tingling with heat that hadn't fully faded even with Isolde gone. 5 years of stagnation. 5 years of being told I was the weakest Ashvane in 3 centuries of family history. And in the span of one single morning, I'd gone from disowned embarrassment to the reason an ancient hunting organization was about to descend on my family's front gates. Draven had spent years promising to end my name. Instead, today, my name had just become the single most dangerous thing in the Empire. That should have felt like a victory. For about 10 seconds, standing in that courtyard with blood on my hand, and my whole family staring at me like I was a stranger, it did. Then, far in the distance, past the estate walls, past the sleeping city beyond them, a second sigil lit up the sky, brighter than the first, closer than the first, and this time it didn't fade after 3 seconds. This time it kept burning. Elder Solvette's face went the color of old parchment. "That's not a scout mark," she whispered. "That's a summons. The Cinder Court isn't sending one hunter anymore." I already knew what she was going to say next before she said it, because some part of the fire in my chest, some ancient instinct that had been asleep for 200 years, already recognized exactly what that burning symbol in the sky meant. "They're sending the court itself," she finished. "All of it, and they'll be here before the week is out." Draven finally found his voice, quiet, shaken, nothing like the arrogant heir who'd tried to kill me at dawn. "What do we do?" I looked at the fading sigil in the dirt beneath my boots, at the blood still drying on my palm, at the family that had spent 5 years erasing me, and now had no choice but to bet everything on the exact thing they'd almost thrown away. "We stop asking what we do," I said, "and start asking how strong this thing inside me can actually get. Because by the end of this week, it's not going to matter whether I'm the weakest Ashvane in 300 years. It's only going to matter whether I'm strong enough to survive being the reason the Cinder Court finally came home." The sigil in the sky hadn't finished burning before my father turned to Elder Solvette and said the words that would define the rest of my week. "How long do we have?" Solvette didn't answer right away. She was still staring at the second mark, the one that hadn't faded after 3 seconds like the first one had, the one that kept bleeding light across the clouds like a wound that refused to close. Her hands were shaking. I'd never seen her hands shake before. This was a woman who'd overseen 40 years of provings, who'd watched boys and girls half my age get quietly erased from family records without so much as a change in her expression, and now she was standing in the training yard, looking like the sky itself had personally threatened her. "Days," she finally said. "Maybe less. A summons mark of that size doesn't get raised for a scouting report. It gets raised when the full court has already voted." "Voted on what?" Draven asked, and his voice still had that shaken quality to it, like the boy who'd smiled while trying to kill me an hour ago had been replaced by someone smaller. Solvette looked at him like the answer should have been obvious. "On whether Kieran lives." Nobody said anything for a moment. The torches around the courtyard were still out. The wicks blackened from whatever had snuffed them the second that first sigil appeared, and in the gray pre-dawn light, everyone standing there looked like ghosts of themselves. My father, my brother, cousins who'd spent 5 years pretending I didn't exist, now staring at me like I was the only solid thing in the entire courtyard. My hand was still bleeding. I hadn't noticed until Solvette grabbed my wrist and turned my palm up, inspecting the cut Isolde's blade had left, the one that had somehow lit the ground on fire when it hit the dirt. "This needs to stop bleeding before we do anything else," she said, and there was something almost gentle in how she said it, a version of care I hadn't heard directed at me since before my mother died. "And you need sleep. Real sleep. Whatever woke up in you today isn't finished waking up, and an exhausted body makes for a dangerous vessel." "Sleep," I repeated, and I actually laughed, short and humorless, because the idea felt insane. "You just told me an ancient hunting cult is sending its entire leadership to my front door, and you want me to take a nap." "I want you," Solvette said, voice sharpening into something closer to the elder I remembered, "to still be standing when they arrive. Which means you rest now, while you can, because you will not get the chance later." She was right. I hated that she was right. But some old instinct, older than 5 years of being ignored in this house, told me to listen to her anyway. My father gave a short nod, the kind that used to mean nothing to me and now, after everything, felt like it meant something different. Draven didn't say anything at all. He just watched me get led back toward the mansion, his expression unreadable, his hands still trembling faintly at his sides. That should have been the end of the morning. It wasn't, because I barely made it through the door before the questions started. The Ashvane mansion had never been quiet, not really, not with 300 years of family history crammed into every hallway and portrait, but the quiet that followed me down those halls that morning was a different kind. Servants stopped what they were doing to watch me pass. A few of them actually bowed, which felt so wrong I almost told them to stop, except some part of me, some new and unfamiliar part, liked it more than I wanted to admit. I didn't get sleep, not really. I got maybe 2 hours of restless half-consciousness on top of my blankets, still in my bloodied training clothes, before Elder Solvette came to collect me herself. "Up," she said, standing in my doorway like she owned the place, which, given how the last 12 hours had gone, she might as well have. "We start now. You said sleep first." I said rest. "You've had some. It'll have to be enough." She looked at my hand, at the cut that had scabbed over faster than any wound I'd ever had, faster than should have been possible, and something in her expression flickered with an emotion I couldn't name. "The fire in your chest doesn't wait for anyone's convenience, Kieran. Not even yours. We start now, or we don't start in time." That was the moment I understood this wasn't going to be normal training. Normal training was drills and forms and getting yelled at by instructors who'd already decided you'd never amount to anything. This was something else. This was survival prep, dressed up in the language of a lesson. She led me down through the mansion, past the training grounds where Draven had nearly ended my life a few hours earlier, past the family shrine where 3 centuries of Ashvane portraits hung in silent, unimpressed rows, and down a set of stone stairs I'd never once been shown in 15 years of living in that house. The air changed as we descended, cooler, older, carrying a mineral smell like wet stone and something else underneath it, something faintly like ash. "What is this place?" I asked. "The archive vault," Solvette said. "Every Ashvane family record that was ever considered too dangerous, too embarrassing, or too inconvenient to keep upstairs gets buried down here instead. Including," she added, pushing open a heavy iron door, "records about your mother." My chest tightened. "You knew. This whole time, you knew what she was." "I suspected," Solvette said. "Suspicion and confirmation are different animals, Kieran. I've spent 40 years watching this family's records, and I've spent 40 years noticing the gaps in them. Your mother's early history has more gaps than any Ashvane bride in 300 years. No verified birthplace, no verified lineage before her marriage. A woman doesn't erase that much of her own past by accident." She led me into a narrow chamber lined with shelves of sealed scrolls and locked ledgers, most of them coated in a layer of dust that suggested nobody had opened them in decades. She pulled one down, a slim volume bound in cracked black leather, and set it on the stone table between us. "This is everything the family archive has on the dragon sovereign extinction," she said. "It isn't much. Most of what the Empire allowed to survive was rewritten so many times it barely resembles the truth anymore. But there's enough here to start understanding what you're dealing with." I opened it. The pages were brittle. The ink faded to a dull brown, but the words were still legible, and what they described made my stomach turn. 200 years ago, the Dragon Sovereign line hadn't been some minor bloodlines scattered at the Empire's edges. According to the fragments in that book, they'd once ruled directly, before the current Imperial family, before the Ashvanes had ever picked up a sword worth remembering. The Sovereigns had governed through something the records called blood-bound authority, a kind of power that didn't just make its bearer strong, but made the land itself answer to them. Crops grew better under a sovereign's rule. Storms broke around their strongholds instead of through them. The empire that replaced them, according to this account, hadn't overthrown a tyrant. They'd murdered a family that the world genuinely loved, because the empire's new rulers couldn't stand sharing power with something even more legitimate than themselves. "That's not what you told me this morning," I said, looking up at Solvette. "This morning you said they were hunted because of what wakes up alongside their strength, ancient enemies." "Both things can be true," she said. "The Cinder Court's official founding myth says they were formed to protect the Empire from a dangerous bloodline and the dangerous enemies bound to it. That's the myth every court member has been raised on for 2 centuries. But myths are written by winners, Kieran, and the winners in this story were the ones doing the killing." She tapped the page in front of me. "This record was written by someone inside this family, generations before your grandmother's grandmother. Someone who apparently had access to information the Empire wanted buried. I don't know how much of it is true, but I know enough to be worried that the version of history you've been handed by the Cinder Court might be exactly the version your enemies want you to believe. I sat with that for a long moment. The fire in my chest, quiet since I'd woken from my half-sleep, stirred faintly, like it had been listening the whole time and had opinions about what it heard. So which is it? I asked. Am I the descendant of some ancient royal line the Empire murdered out of jealousy? Or am I the last carrier of something so dangerous it needed 200 years of hunting to keep contained? Solvet's expression didn't soften. I don't know. And until we do know, you train as if both things are true at once. You learn control because an uncontrolled fire burns everyone around it regardless of how noble its bloodline was. And you learn history because ignorance is the fastest way to get yourself killed by people who understand what you are better than you do. That was as close to an answer as I was going to get. And honestly, it was more than I'd expected walking down those stairs. We spent the next hour going through what fragments remained, most of them frustratingly incomplete. Sentences cut off mid-thought where entire pages had been torn out at some point in the archive's history. Someone, at some point, had deliberately made sure this story could never be fully reconstructed. Then Solvet closed the book, and her expression shifted into something more immediate. Enough history for now, she said. Your control matters more than your bloodline's politics today. Come, we need open ground, and we need it now, before that fire decides to introduce itself to the rest of the estate without your permission. She wasn't exaggerating the urgency. We'd barely made it back up to the training grounds, the same cracked earth from that morning's duel still scarred with the fading remnants of the sigil, when the heat in my chest flared without warning, sharp and sudden, like something had reached in and yanked a cord I didn't know existed. My arm caught fire, not metaphorically. Actual flame, crawling up from my palm to my elbow in the space of a single heartbeat, and the pain that came with it wasn't like burning at all. It was like something trying to force its way out through skin that wasn't built to contain it. I shouted, more out of shock than agony, and stumbled backward, swinging my arm like that would somehow put it out. Don't panic, Solvet said, though her own voice had gone tight. Panic feeds it. Breathe. It's on fire, I said, which felt like a fairly reasonable thing to point out given the circumstances. Yes, and it isn't spreading to your clothes, isn't blackening your skin, isn't behaving like ordinary fire at all, which means it's answering to something inside you, not consuming you from outside. Breathe, Kieran. Command it. Don't fight it like an enemy. Direct it like a limb you forgot you had. Easy for her to say. She wasn't the one with flames licking up her forearm like her own blood had decided to become something else entirely. But underneath the panic, some instinct clawed its way forward. The same instinct that had let me catch Draven's blade that morning without thinking, and I forced myself to stop swinging my arm and just stood there instead. Breathing, staring at fire that didn't hurt the way fire should hurt. Slowly, it listened. Not immediately. Not gently. It guttered and flared 3 separate times before it finally sank back beneath my skin, leaving my arm tingling and raw but unmarked. No burns, no blisters, nothing to show for what had just happened, except the lingering smell of smoke and the fact that my sleeve had somehow survived completely intact. Good, Solvet said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced by her own assessment. That's the first time. It will not be the last time, and each time will demand more control than the one before it, because the fire isn't static, Kieran. It's growing, and it's going to keep growing whether you're ready for it or not. We tried again, and again. Over the next several hours, my body became a battlefield between whatever ancient thing lived in my blood and my own increasingly exhausted attempts to keep it contained. Sometimes it was my arm. Once it was my eyes, vision flooding gold for nearly a full minute, while Solvet stood 2 feet away giving instructions I could barely hear over the roar in my own skull. Once, terrifyingly, it was my voice, words coming out layered and doubled, like someone ancient was speaking directly through me without asking permission first. Each outburst left me weaker. Each one left the fire a little more settled, a little more patient, like it was learning the shape of the body it now called home, and adjusting its behavior accordingly. By the time the sun dipped low enough to paint the training grounds orange, matching, unhelpfully, the color of my own uncontrolled flames, I was on my knees in the dirt, soaked in sweat, arms trembling from exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical exertion, and everything to do with the strain of holding something enormous, just barely inside its cage. That's enough for today, Solvet said, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked almost sympathetic. You've made more progress in one day than most awakened bloodlines make in a month. That should frighten you as much as it should encourage you. Why frighten me? I asked, too tired to fully process the warning in her tone. Because a fire that learns this fast, she said, usually does so because it's being pushed, and I don't yet know who, or what, is doing the pushing. I didn't have an answer for that. I didn't have the energy for one. I just knelt there in the dirt, arms shaking, watching the last embers of my own uncontrolled power fade back beneath my skin, and thought about how strange it was that 5 years of being told I'd never amount to anything had ended not with proof that they were wrong, but with proof that they had no idea what they'd actually been looking at. That night, I learned something else. Something that had nothing to do with fire. I couldn't sleep, not really, not with my body still humming faintly from the day's training, so I found myself wandering the mansion's east wing well past midnight, past portraits of Ashvane ancestors who'd never had to deal with anything like what I was dealing with, when I heard voices coming from behind a half-closed study door. Draven's voice, and another voice, unfamiliar, low and careful in the way people speak when they don't want to be overheard. I should have walked away. I didn't. The Ashvane name means nothing anymore, Draven was saying, and there was a rawness in his voice I'd never heard from him before. None of the arrogance from that morning's duel, just something closer to desperation. Everyone's going to remember him, the freak who caught a blade with his bare hand. Nobody's going to remember I was the heir for 15 years before he woke up and stole it. That's precisely why House Valand is interested in speaking with you, the unfamiliar voice said, smooth, patient, the voice of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this exact kind of conversation many times before. The Empire doesn't reward bloodlines anymore, young Ashvane. It rewards usefulness, and a scorned heir with intimate knowledge of an awakening dragon sovereign's weaknesses is extremely useful to the right people. My stomach dropped. I'm not betraying my family, Draven said, though the way he said it sounded less like conviction and more like a man trying to convince himself. No one's asking you to, the voice said. We're simply asking you to remember who you are, and to consider that perhaps your family forgot to properly value you long before your brother's blood woke up. House Valand remembers loyalty. House Valand remembers value. All we ask in return is information. Should the Cinder Court's arrival create opportunities? I didn't hear the rest. I couldn't. My pulse was pounding too loud in my ears, and the fire in my chest had flared hot and sharp, angry in a way that felt less like instinct and more like betrayal recognizing itself. My own brother. Hours after nearly dying twice in one day, hours after watching me almost get executed by a hunter from an organization that wanted me dead, and Draven was in a side study making deals with a rival house behind our father's back. I didn't confront him, not yet. Some cold, calculating part of me, the same part that had stopped me from unloading 5 years of resentment onto him in the courtyard that morning, told me this wasn't the moment. Not when I didn't know how deep this alliance went, not when I didn't know what House Valand actually wanted. Beyond information, beyond opportunities left deliberately vague. I walked away instead, back to my room, back to a bed I still couldn't properly sleep in, and lay there in the dark turning that conversation over and over, wondering how many other secrets this family was hiding behind its ancient portraits and its careful silences. The next 2 days blurred together in a haze of exhausting training and half-formed suspicion. Solvet pushed me harder each session, and each session I lasted a little longer before the fire found a new way to slip its leash. My reflexes sharpened. My control, while still nowhere close to reliable, stopped feeling like an emergency every single time it flared. Small victories, but victories nonetheless, the kind I desperately needed after 5 years of nothing but stagnation and failure. I watched Draven too, whenever I could, without making it obvious I was watching. He was quieter than usual, distracted, disappearing for stretches of time nobody could quite account for. Once I caught him receiving a folded letter from a servant I didn't recognize, tucking it away into his coat before anyone else noticed. He never mentioned House Valand to me directly. I never mentioned what I'd overheard. We circled each other instead, two brothers pretending the morning's duel hadn't happened, pretending the last 5 years hadn't happened, both of us apparently deciding that pretending was easier than confronting whatever came next. It was the third night after the duel when everything accelerated. I was in the training yard again, alone this time, practicing the breathing exercises Solvet had drilled into me, trying to coax the fire into something resembling obedience without her supervision, when the sky above the estate lit up gold. Not the burning sigil from before, something new, a single, sustained pillar of light, descending slowly from somewhere high above the clouds, moving with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of something that had never once in its existence needed to hurry. The entire household spilled out of the mansion within minutes, drawn by the light like moths, my father at the front, Elder Solvet close behind him, Draven trailing at the edges looking paler than I'd seen him since the duel itself. The light resolved, slowly, into a figure. Not Isolde, someone else entirely, dressed in robes that carried no house crest, no Cinder Court sigil, nothing that marked them as belonging to any faction I'd yet encountered. They landed in the center of the training grounds without so much as disturbing the dirt beneath their feet, and when they straightened, I found myself looking at someone who radiated a kind of authority that made even Elder Solvet instinctively take a half-step back. "Kieran Ashvane," the figure said, voice carrying an odd, formal weight to it, like every word had been chosen days in advance. "By decree of His Imperial Majesty, ruler of the Empire, and steward of its provinces, you are hereby summoned to present yourself before the crown." My father found his voice first, sharp with a kind of alarm I'd never heard from him. "On what grounds? My son has committed no crime." "The crown does not require grounds to summon what belongs to it," the messenger said, and something about the phrase "what belongs to it" sent a fresh wave of cold through my chest, colder than anything the fire had managed to counter in 3 days of training. The sigil that appeared over this estate 3 nights ago was visible from the capital itself. His Majesty's court has taken considerable interest in the reappearance of the Dragon Sovereign bloodline, and considerable interest in ensuring that interest is not misdirected toward hostile organizations before the crown has had the opportunity to make its own claim. "Claim?" I repeated, and the word tasted wrong in my mouth. "I'm not property." The messenger's expression didn't change. "That determination will be made by the crown, not by you. You are to present yourself at the capital within 3 days. Failure to appear will be considered an act of defiance against the throne itself, with all the consequences that implies for your family, your title, and your estate. 3 days. The same window Solvet had estimated the Cinder Court would need to arrive. I looked at my father. His face had gone tight, calculating in a way that felt disturbingly familiar to the expression he'd worn right after the duel, the moment he'd asked "What did your mother do?" instead of asking if I was all right. Except this time there was something else beneath the calculation, something that looked, unmistakably, like fear. "The Cinder Court is already moving against him," my father said. "If the crown summons him to the capital at the same moment the court arrives to collect him, we hand him directly into the middle of a war between 2 factions that both want him dead or owned." "That is not the crown's concern," the messenger said simply. "That is Kieran Ashvane's very fortunate problem to solve." I stood there in the middle of my own family's training grounds, 3 nights removed from being the family embarrassment nobody bothered to remember, now apparently valuable enough that an empire and an ancient hunting cult were both racing to claim me before the other one could, and felt the fire in my chest stir again, low and steady, like it understood something I was only just beginning to grasp. Being weak had made me invisible for 5 years. Being strong, apparently, made me a prize everyone wanted to own. The messenger's light began to fade, the same slow, unhurried descent reversing itself back into the sky, and their final words hung in the cold night air long after their glow had disappeared entirely. 3 days, Kieran Ashvane. The Empire is not known for its patience, and the crown has already waited 200 years to reclaim what it believes was always meant to belong to it. Behind me, I heard Elder Solvet's sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone finally understanding a piece of the puzzle that had been missing all along. "Belong to it," she repeated quietly, almost to herself. "Not protect, not eliminate, reclaim." She turned to look at me, and for the first time since I'd woken up whatever ancient thing lived in my blood, I saw real fear in the old elder's eyes, the kind of fear that came from finally understanding a truth far larger and far more dangerous than the one she'd spent her whole life preparing for. "Kieran," she said slowly, "I don't think the Empire hunted the Dragon Sovereigns to destroy them at all. I think they hunted them to make sure nobody else could have them first." Above us, the sky had gone dark and quiet again, but the cold that settled over that courtyard had nothing to do with the missing light, and everything to do with the sudden, sickening realization that whatever war was coming for my family wasn't between 2 sides. It was between three: the Cinder Court, the Empire, and somewhere out there, still unaccounted for, whatever ancient enemy had been bound to my bloodline for 2 centuries, patiently waiting its own turn to collect what it believed was owed. 3 days. That was all I had left before every single one of them arrived at my door at once, and for the first time since the fire woke up inside me, I understood that surviving Draven's blade, surviving Isolde's sword, might have only been the smallest, easiest part of what was still ahead.